This review is going to be organized around developments in specific regions from the year 1200 to 1450, and then end with trade networks that develop between that time frame as well. So obviously you can't study the history of the world without studying major religions. Although this course starts at the year 1200 and most major religions originated well before that time, I still included a series of YouTube videos that I expect you to watch on the development of major religions such as Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and more. I also wanted to take this time to highlight some misconceptions about religions. Religions are internally diverse. They're not uniform. Religions are constantly being interpreted and reinterpreted by believers, and they're embedded in cultures and even politics, and not isolated from that. Especially as religions begin to diffuse and spread and come into contact with other cultures, it gives rise to the development of syncretic religions. I've included the definition of syncretism right here. So syncretism is the fusion of diverse practices and beliefs. So when I think of syncretism, I actually think about contemporary debates about Santa Claus's race. For several people in the African American community, Santa Claus is shown as black. This is an example of syncretism because obviously the African American community seems to adopt some of the stories of Christmas or some of the fictional stories that are pitched to children about Christmas, but changes the race of Santa Claus to have unique meaning for their own children. Kelly famously ran a segment on Fox News where she said that Santa Claus was just white, is just white. So I guess that's the debate that I was referring to, but in actuality, should it really be a debate? He's Santa Claus. So now we're going to switch to Islam and talking about the political communities that Islam gives rise to in AP World History. So the Prophet Muhammad was both a religious leader and a politician. He led an Islamic caliphate or state that has since spread across Arabia. Islam is a religion, but in its early days and in the period 1200 to 1450, it gives rise to a lot of Islamic states. Islam today is behind Christianity as the second largest religion in the world. After the death of Muhammad, Islam spread rapidly through military actions, merchants, and missionaries. Military actions refers to the expansion pursued by Islamic states. The Abbasid Caliphate was a highly influential Islamic state that eventually collapses in 1258. Honest, this course is a hot mess because it randomly starts at the year 1200, so we don't necessarily get to see the origins of the Islamic state of the Abbasid Caliphate, which begins in 1750. So essentially, shortly after this course's start date, 1200, one of the major Islamic empires declines. The decline of the Abbasid Caliphate doesn't necessarily mean the decline of Islam. There was a wide variety of other Islamic states that develop individually, and we'll talk more about those in lecture. Just some more context, the Abbasid dynasty built a beautiful capital at Baghdad, and the empire was built around trade, as most successful empires are usually built around trade. The decline of the Islamic Caliphate, there were Sunni and Shia divisions. We talked about the Sunni and Shia split, which is still a major motivating force in Middle Eastern politics today, and numerous rival factions also destabilized the central authority of Baghdad. It didn't necessarily challenge the legitimacy of Islam, but it certainly challenged the legitimacy of the government that ruled from Baghdad. The Mongols give the Abbasid Caliphate its death blow in 1258. The Mongols are obviously this major force in world history. So Islam has a profound effect on Africa. We'll talk about exactly what a state is in a little bit, but many African societies were stateless. So basically, they didn't have an organized and centralized government before Islam. So Islam comes to Africa from missionaries, and we'll learn in the next slide from merchants as well. And the Islam is a very attractive religion because it's focused on egalitarianism, which you should know from watching the YouTube videos in the description. So what made the Trans-Saharan trade route possible? Well, camels for one, camel saddles, and caravans. Caravans were just traveling in groups of people for protection. Trade both extended the domains of Islam and allowed West Africans to meet their basic needs. West Africans ventured into the Sahara because they were in search of salt. and they met Islamic merchants that traded with Africans because Africans, especially West Africans, tended to have plentiful gold reserves. The Trans-Saharan trade route gives rise to the Mali and Songhai empires. You'll see them on the next slide. One of the greatest Malian rulers, Mansa Musa, built a capital at Timbuktu and expanded the kingdom well beyond the bounds of Ghana. In 1324, Musa made a pilgrimage to Mecca, complete with an entourage of hundreds of gold-carrying servants and camels. So the leaders of the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires converted to Islam to gain political influence. Islam was great because it was a means of organizing the people. Where Islam did not penetrate in Central Africa, states formed later on. Here you can see the overlap between the Songhai and Mali empires. Here's kind of just a repetition of key points about the Trans-Saharan trade route. Interesting point here, the growth of trade necessitated the growth of government. Currencies were created, militaries were risen. Governments often make trade possible by protecting and helping facilitate trade and exchange of goods and services, and also standard currencies. So this developed, of course, with the Trans-Saharan trade route in the Mali and Songhai empires in particular. It's also important to note that the spread of Islam did open Africa to trade, but most of Africa developed independently. So the two main empires that develop in the Americas are the Incan and the Aztec empires in AP World History. We'll see that they are eventually conquered by European conquistadors, and we'll get to that when we review Unit 3 and 4. Now I guess we're just going to describe the characteristics of these empires. So the Aztecs were a major empire that arrived in central Mexico in the mid-1200s. They are known in pop culture. When you're thinking about them, you're thinking about gold, pyramids, and human sacrifices. The Aztecs didn't have a centralized bureaucracy, so they weren't exactly a modern state, and we'll talk about what's a modern state in a bit. But they did have a tribute empire, so they allowed the regions that they conquered to basically exercise their own form of government and rule, as long as they paid tribute, gave goods and services to the Tenochtitlan, the capital. The Aztec religious system was tied to the military because one of the purposes of the military was to obtain victims for human sacrifice. The Aztecs believed that victims or human sacrifices were ways to repay the gods, helped nourish them. So on the left-hand corner, you can see a excavation of an Aztec skull rack. So skull racks were literally the Aztecs hung the skulls of their victims on a series of horizontal and vertical poles to both to likely intimidate maybe people that traveled into the city, or some form of legitimation or artwork. So the Incan Empire was also expansionist like the Aztecs. They controlled their territory using a professional army. They were more centralized. They had an established bureaucracy, so closer to a modern state, and we'll see what that means in a bit. A unified language, and they also had a complex systems of roads and tunnels, advanced irrigation as well. Here are the similarities and differences between these two empires. I imagine on the FRQ that you'll be given, you don't necessarily need to compare these empires, but maybe you'll need to talk a lot about European colonialism and the conquests. And so definitely talking about the conquests of the Aztecs and the Incas would be hugely important, or a good specific and relevant piece of evidence. Just some context. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, West Europe was left mostly decentralized, so there was no centralized bureaucratic governments that existed. The Middle Ages is a time frame that is in popular culture depicted as being very backward. It's a time from the fall of the Roman Empire, the 5th century, to the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453. So again, this course is a hot mess because we're still in the Middle Ages technically, but we never see the beginning of the Middle Ages when we start at the year 1200. But nonetheless, Christianity is the main religion in throughout Western Europe, and the religions of other societies like Islam are often viewed with suspicion. Also, that's just say Asia, African, and Arab societies, not nations. They're not synonyms. So, in a time of decentralization, religion held many places in Europe together. The Catholic Church was a highly organized institution, but it was also very corrupt. So, it almost kind of perverts the ideas that are expounded in the Bible, and we'll see that this comes to a flashpoint with the Protestant Reformation in units 3 and 4, which we'll talk about later. But the church is highly corrupt in some ways. The church is also does not like people questioning its authority, and so people that cite reason to question its authority are often labeled heretics. There's the famous Inquisition launched by the Pope that you can read more about in your Princeton Review. The Christian Crusades tried to end Muslim rule in the Holy Land. It was successful in some places, but also unsuccessful in others. But most importantly, it opened up the West to trade and contact with Islamic ideas and advancements in both mathematics and science that Islamic societies had made. The European feudal system, which is a social, economic, and political system, is all the rave when we discuss developments in Europe over the next couple of weeks. So it's basically a system where land is central to it. So the king provides land to the nobles, and in return, the nobles give money and knights to the king. The nobles then provide land to knights, and knights provide protection and military service to the nobles. And then finally, the knights provide land and protection to the peasants that work the land and provide food and services to the knights. So it's a static system. It's a social, economic, and political system, and we'll discuss the implications of it in terms of being distinct from a modern state. It's completely distinct from the political systems that we see that exist in the world today. So what do I mean by this? In the old days, in the feudal system especially, violence was private and diffused. So in Europe, violence was private and diffused. So what does this mean? Nobles, feudal lords, landowners, bandits, serfs, private citizens, and ordinary men, it was mostly men, possessed and used lethal weapons rather liberally. So the authority to use violence was dispersed. It was private. And you can think of this almost in terms of a protection racket. The feudal system was kind of a bit of a protection racket. Racketeering in the modern context is often associated with crime bosses. This is from The Godfather. I've never actually seen The Godfather, but I've seen other gangster movies by Martin Scorsese that are really good, like The Departed. That's a side point. But racketeering is like those, accents like, "That's a nice house you got there. Be a real shame if something happened to it." That's the kind of racketeering that we're talking about. But what do we mean by the feudal system was essentially essentially a racketeering system? What we mean by it, it's kind of like a protection racket. So in a protection racket, an entity may threaten to cause harm to someone or an individual's property if the owner does not pay a fee for protection. And so that fee comes in the form of military service for knights, or it comes in the form of food and services for peasants, right? And in exchange, they're offered protection. So the feudal system is kind of like a protection racket. So the feudal system eventually gives way to a system of states, and we see the emergence of nation states. Nation states don't develop fully in this time period, and we'll explain what that is. The first nation state actually appears around 1789, and so we'll get to that when we review Unit 5 and Unit 6. But by the close of the Middle Ages, Western Europe began to organize along cultural and linguistic lines. So in essence, they started to organize around national lines, right? But This actually comes after the creation of a modern state. And so I will make a large effort to kind of introduce some political theory to you right now. Before I do, though, I just want to talk about the plague at the same time in Western Europe as states are starting to develop, and we'll talk about what a state is in a bit. The plague is wreaking or is causing a lot of havoc. The Black Death starts to spread across Europe in 1300, and actually 1/3 of the European population dies. And we'll talk about the significance of this, especially when we get into the Mongols, as kind of a consequence of connectivity. So the world today is comprised of a series of nation states, and we'll get into the nation concept when we talk about nationalism in Unit 6. But for right now, we're just going to focus on the creation of a state. And so the state is completely different from the feudal system. A state, first of all, what is it? It's the monopoly on the legitimate use of coercive violence in a given territory. The United States is one example of a state. It's completely different from the feudal system, right? There are no peasants that actually have to provide services in order to get protection. There are no nobles that provide land to people in order to get protection. The only one that has the legitimate use of violence is the United States government, and the people that the United States government allows to have the legitimate use of violence. So modern states generally have a bureaucracy. So a bureaucracy is a differentiated set of institution and personnel. So think big governments. So like Song China has a famous bureaucracy. The Roman Empire had a bureaucracy. After the fall of the Roman Empire, of course, things become more decentralized and that bureaucracy disappears. So political development isn't necessarily one trajectory. I don't know whether there's going to be some type of different political entity in the world today that is more important. The world we live in now is predominantly comprised of a series of states in the international system and not feudal systems like that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the end point of history, right? The other thing that a state has is it has centrality. That's one characteristic. So political relations radiate outwards from the center. So, for example, in the United States, that centrality is the United States government. The United States government is supreme, right? It's based in a central location, almost in Washington, D.C., and all political decisions are either allowed to take place because the United States allows it to happen, right? The United States government allows it to happen. The United States bureaucracy. There's a huge government workforce. I think 40% of people employed in the United States actually work for the United States government. Huge bureaucracy. So how do states come into being? So there's this great claim that, or thesis that is made by Tilley, he's a sociologist and political scientist, that war made the state and the state made war. And so his argument is that the series of protection rackets, those feudal kingdoms that you see, start to develop into modern states in Europe. Of course, Tilley is focused on Europe, but you can also make the argument that the Song dynasty in China, for example, with its imperial bureaucracy, was already more advanced than the European feudal kingdoms because they already have had kind of more of a state system in place. But Tilley makes the argument that these feudal kingdoms started to go to war with one another, and that in itself led to the creation of modern states in Europe. So these feudal kingdoms or early states started fighting wars with other states, and to fight more effective wars and win more, they actually had to build large standing armies. These large standing armies led to the creation of treasuries, more centralized administration, recruitment. So basically, as the feudal kingdom got bigger and expanded, they led to a variety of different kind of centralized organizations that kind of were offshoots of that initial purpose, which was just war making. So war making, to be effective, is a highly logistical task. So states actually had to also extract wealth from the subjects to be more effective at making war, aka, taxes in the modern sense. So effective war making needed essentially a bureaucracy and all kinds of governmental institutions developed out of the raising of large standing militaries in Europe. So why did war occur at all? And the central tragic fact of war in Europe and perhaps around the world, if this model of political development actually applies around the world, is that coercion works. Those who apply substantial force to their fellows get compliance, and from that, advantages of money, goods, services, etc. And so you can see, it really is kind of like a protection racket. Early states, early feudal kingdoms really were kind of a protection racket. Oh, that's a really nice car over there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. And then they extract benefits and resources and stuff like that. So that's just a quote from Tilley's piece, but I want to go to the so what. So as states began to demand more from the people, so the protection racket started demanding more from all kinds of people within that hierarchy, they had to make concessions later on. The demands became very, very large the larger the armies were, right? The larger the government becomes, the more funding it needs, the more taxes, the more resources it needs. So you have to make some form of concessions. We'll talk about those concessions later, but that's actually how nation gets attached to the word state, right? So nation state. And so the idea of nationalism as an imagined community, that's one concession, right? So people might be willing to give stuff to a state that kind of incentivizes nationalism, a state that plays up nationalism, etc. Also, people may be willing to give states if they have a say in what that state does. And so that might be an explanation for democracy, which comes certainly in the Unit 6. We'll talk about that again. And then, of course, states today demand tons of their citizens, right? Your parents pay an arm and a leg in taxes, Mr. Diaz pays in taxes, etc. But they also provide services to their citizens. They provide health care, they provide all kinds of social benefits, unemployment benefits, and education to your parents' children. So it's kind of interesting to think that, according to Tilley, the nation state in Europe has an origins in the feudal kingdoms that were basically just a protection racket, right? States are very effective, at what they do. The legitimate use of violence is now concentrated in nation states around the world. It's not private anymore. Of course, you could make the claim that states don't really originate in Europe, that there are states that develop in China with their imperial bureaucracy, or a state system in the Incan Empire because they also had a bureaucracy and bureaucratic system, or they're like state systems. But it is without a doubt that the reason why the nation state gets kind of exported, so to speak, is because of European colonialism and imperialism that we see a lot of in Unit 3 and Unit 4. That's the reason why the political system that exists today, I'm sorry, the most, that's the reason why the world is basically a series of nation states today. Of course, we've made the point that not all nations have states. We're going to talk about nationalism again more fully in a bit next week. Next week I imagine. Also, one of the things that I want to just say, especially when we're going to talk about the Enlightenment and social contract theory, which, if you remember, is one of the political theories about the origins of politics. State formation really isn't a conscious process, right? There were no creators or designers of the modern state. It kind of just happened, right? There was no plan to create a state. So hopefully this just, if you don't remember social contract theory has a huge effect on world politics. But social contract theory was attempting to explain the origins of political development, the origins of political authority, but we care more about it in AP World History because of its effects on political development and authority. Its effects of destabilizing absolutism, which we'll talk about later. Just kind of to get us prepared for next week, there can be different types of political entities. So this is a model of the power and dimensions of state power. It can be despotic or infrastructural. So despotic power is like coercive force, and then infrastructural power is the ability for states to levy taxes against you, store information about citizens in the census, to kind of just still reach you, aside from beating you up. And so you can see the different types of states with low despotic power, because basically coercive violence was privatized, and low infrastructural coordination are feudal states. States with high despotic power, think the British Empire, and low infrastructural coordination were imperial states. States with low despotic power and high infrastructural coordination are more modern states, and then states with high despotic power and high infrastructural coordination, think Nazi Germany being able to control all aspects of your life, as authoritarian. And so modern is definitely used in the sense of like, the most recent, the most contemporary, but it is now believed, this is obviously from a political scientist, it was once believed that authoritarian states were inferior to democracy, and that all authoritarian states would just become democracies eventually. That has since been questioned, especially with China, and we talked about it in the context of Unit 9. So just think about that now. So maybe China's authoritarian system is a modern state. Now that we're here, let's explain the difference between civilizations and societies. Civilizations usually have all these characteristics. Societies lack one or many. So developments in Asia will focus on the Song dynasty in China, which eventually gets conquered by the Mongols and becomes the Yuan dynasty. And then we'll talk about the Mongols. China had a centralized imperial bureaucracy, and they had required government officials to have merit exams called the civil service exam. So we talked extensively about this. China was actually probably closer to a modern state than European feudal kingdoms were for several centuries, actually, all the way to the Qin dynasty, or the Qin dynasty in 221 CE. So religion in Song China. So Confucianism has a huge effect on the organization of Song China. So Confucianism emphasized filial piety. This was the idea that the men were the head of the household and their needs came first. It also focused on deference to authority. New religions also rose up in China, and we'll talk more about the significance of that next week. China encouraged innovation. There was all kinds of innovations in Song China, from the Grand Canal. Champa rice allowed for the Song dynasty to flourish. It's high caloric rice that grew in dry soil year-round, created a surplus in food. Under the Song dynasty, there was unique luxury goods that were created. So it was really, really cool. Really, that's. I don't know why the heck I said that. I'm just really lame, guys, and it's 1:14 in the morning when I'm making this video. So there was social stratification in China. Women deferred to men for all things. The practice of foot binding was very symbolic of this. The tributary systems, states surrounding China had to pay tribute to China. You could make a remark that this is very similar to the Aztec and Incan empires if you were asked to compare. Just spitballing there. Genghis Khan was the charismatic leader. He was more egalitarian, and he kind of kick-started the Mongol domination in 1209. Mongols were highly efficient, skilled bowsmen. They were very good riders, which allowed them to dominate pretty much any military that they came into contact with. Although Genghis Khan was incredibly brutal, the Mongols did usher in this era of Pax Mongolica. They provided protection along the Silk trade routes that allowed for trade to flourish from Asia into Europe. So it ushered in a period of economic, social, and cultural growth, exchange, and stability. So the Mongols conquered, and Genghis Khan's grandsons conquered distinct parts of the world. These khanates were essentially kingdoms that were distinct. They were they ruled their territories independently. So you can see all the key points under each khanate, which you can see the map of at the beginning of developments in Asia slide. So one thing that allowed the Mongols to be very effective was their tolerance or their assimilation to other cultures. So they were religiously tolerant in the Yuan dynasty. Kublai Khan was religiously tolerant. In the dynasty that Hulagu ran in the Dar al-Islam, he converted to Islam. Mongols didn't have their own bureaucracies. They kind of just used the local organizations that existed in either the societies that they conquered or states even that they conquered, if you consider China a state, for example. One of the consequences of Pax Mongolica was that it led to the transmission of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, from Asia all the way to Europe. The Mongols did protect the Silk Road trade route and increase trade, but with increased connection and integration or connectivity comes consequences. And we've discussed this, and we're very well aware with this in the modern day with us dealing with the coronavirus, right? So being able to make analogies is very important for AP free response questions. So if you were asked about this, you could make an analogy with the coronavirus. Also, please check out the historical analogies Word document that I shared with you guys, because in there are all kinds of analogies and connections that you can draw between diverse time periods and peoples, societies, states, etc. So the Silk Road, you can see the effects of trade along the Silk Road here. One of the things that I wanted to highlight was the growth of flying money, which is kind of like credit systems. Nobody wanted to carry coins because of the implications that came with. Potentially you could be robbed or they were heavy. So credit actually develops. So much like the Trans-Saharan trade route in its early days, you can see trade facilitating the creation of credit institutions, which later become banks. So increased trade, often increased demand for good, often encourages the creation of stronger states. So states don't necessarily just create from war, as we discussed with Tilly. They could also, be encouraged, or state-like institutions could be encouraged from trade. Some of the effects of trade are obviously cultural diffusion, the development of syncretic lifestyles, etc. And so you go ahead and read through these slides about the Indian Ocean trade.